She warned me it could ruin her career. I never imagined it would steal my heart. The first day in a new job always feels like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, and for me, it was no different. I walked into the sleek glass-fronted office, the hum of computers and quiet chatter filling the air like a low, constant heartbeat. I carried a mix of excitement and apprehension, eager to prove myself yet aware that I was the youngest person in the room by at least a decade. Then I met her, my boss. She was in her early 40s, a vision of quiet authority, moving with an effortless grace that immediately commanded attention without demanding it. Her tailored blazer fit perfectly over a blouse that hinted at a delicate elegance, and her hair was styled just enough to be professional but soft enough to feel approachable. She didn't smile much at first, but when she did, it was subtle, almost secretive, a faint curve of her lips that suggested she noticed more than she let on. Our first interaction happened during a briefing in the main conference room. She spoke with calm precision, her voice carrying a warmth beneath its professional cadence. I found myself watching not just her words but the small gestures that accompanied them, the slight tilt of her head as she considered a point, the brief, almost imperceptible glances she cast around the room, and the way she rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, fingers curling slightly as though anchoring herself in the moment. I noticed how her presence seemed to pull the room into a quieter rhythm. The usual office chatter felt muted when she spoke, and even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. When she handed me the project brief, our fingers brushed lightly. It was accidental, but in that instant, a strange warmth ran through me, and I caught myself smiling nervously. As I settled at my desk, I couldn't help but notice her presence lingering even after she walked away. The faint scent of her perfume clung to the air, subtle, not overpowering, but impossible to ignore. I realized I was already studying her without meaning to, the way she moved between desks, the quiet confidence in her posture, the slight vulnerability she tried to mask behind polished professionalism. There was a depth to her that went beyond appearances, something I sensed in the way she listened, considered, and occasionally exhaled a quiet sigh when she thought no one was watching. By the end of the day, I knew one thing: this wasn't just another job. Something about her, the mixture of strength and quiet vulnerability, authority and approachability, had unsettled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. And though I couldn't yet name it, I felt the first, delicate stirrings of a curiosity that might just become something far more profound. It started innocuously enough, late nights at the office, the kind of work that demanded focus but also revealed the unspoken rhythms of the people around you. I had stayed behind to finish a critical report, and she was there too, reviewing slides for a presentation no one else had been asked to prepare. The office was quieter now, the usual buzz replaced by the soft click of keyboards, the low hum of the air conditioning, and the occasional shuffle of papers. Sitting across from her, I became acutely aware of the small details I hadn't noticed during the day, the way the desk lamp cast a gentle glow across her features, softening the sharpness of her expression, the way her fingers moved as she annotated documents, deliberate, elegant, and almost mesmerizing. And then, almost by accident, our hands brushed as we reached for the same folder. It was fleeting, but the warmth of her skin against mine lingered far longer than it should have. My chest tightened slightly, a mixture of surprise and something deeper I wasn't ready to name. She looked up, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us. Her eyes held a faint curiosity, a subtle acknowledgement of that fleeting contact. There was no overt flirtation, but the unspoken connection was electric, a quiet tension that neither of us tried to dissolve immediately. She offered a small, approving smile, just enough to make my heart race and my thoughts scatter. As we worked side by side, I noticed how she leaned slightly closer when explaining a point, her voice warm yet controlled, brushing against my ears in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I caught myself stealing glances at the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, and the way her hair fell gently over her shoulder. She seemed unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, of the effect she had, moving with that natural poise that made everything about her feel effortless. Internally, I wrestled with a growing awareness. I wanted to focus on the work, to maintain the professionalism I had promised myself, yet my thoughts kept returning to her, to the softness behind her confidence, to the rare vulnerability glimpsed in her fleeting sighs. Every brush of her hand, every shared glance, became a small, unspoken dialogue between us, a tension that was delicate, thrilling, and dangerous in its own subtle way. By the time we finally wrapped up the work, the office had emptied, leaving only the two of us in the warm glow of the desk lamps. We exchanged a quiet nod, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had formed during the hours of shared effort. And as I packed my things, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The line between professional and personal, once clear and well-defined, now felt blurred, and I wasn't sure I wanted it any other way. It was another late evening in the office, though this one felt different. The hum of computers and the distant murmur of the cleaning crew outside had created a quiet cocoon, leaving only the soft click of our keyboards and the occasional rustle of papers. I was engrossed in finalizing the day's reports when she leaned over my desk, her presence suddenly filling the space in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "I haven't always had it easy," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself, but her eyes found mine immediately. There was a subtle vulnerability there, a glimpse behind the carefully curated armor of professionalism. She shared a story, a risky career decision years ago, a moment when she had doubted herself and faced consequences that could have derailed her entire path. Her voice was steady, but I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gestured. I found myself leaning in, captivated not just by her words, but by the honesty she was showing. It was unexpected, this window into her world, and it stirred something inside me. Without thinking, my hand brushed against hers as I reached for a folder she had set down beside me. The contact was fleeting, but electric, and neither of us immediately pulled away. Our eyes met, a silent acknowledgement passing between us, fragile yet charged. For the first time, I saw her not just as my boss, but as a woman, strong, graceful, but quietly human, with fears and doubts like anyone else. She seemed to notice my attention, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, but it was tinged with something softer, almost tender. The space between us felt smaller than before, the air warmer, as if the universe had drawn us closer in these few quiet minutes. The office light cast a gentle glow over her features, softening the edges of her sharp composure. I noticed the slight arch of her brow, the delicate curve of her cheek, and the way her hair fell over one shoulder as she shifted to face me. Each subtle movement seemed to carry meaning, though I wasn't sure if it was intentional or merely the natural rhythm of her presence. By the time she straightened and returned to her desk, the room felt charged with unspoken possibilities. A quiet energy lingered, the kind that makes your chest tighten with anticipation and your mind whirl with what-ifs. I realized that this moment had changed something fundamental between us. The professional distance had thinned, replaced by a delicate connection that was equal parts trust, curiosity, and something far more tender. As I packed my things that night, I caught a final glance at her across the room. She was focused on her work, but I knew that behind her calm exterior, she had allowed herself to be seen, and in doing so, she had let me see her heart, just a little. The days that followed were colored by a quiet tension I couldn't ignore. Every interaction with her carried a subtle weight, a charged undercurrent beneath the usual office routines. I noticed it in the way she lingered a fraction longer when giving instructions, the soft brush of her hand against mine when passing documents, the lingering glances that felt like unspoken questions we both knew we weren't supposed to answer. Each moment was innocent enough on its own, yet collectively, they built a tide of internal conflict I struggled to navigate. Rumors began to circulate quietly among colleagues, whispers about promotions, alliances, and office politics. I felt an uneasy knot of anxiety every time someone walked past our desks. Was our closeness noticeable? Had I misread her intentions, or worse, had she misread mine? The thought that our growing connection might threaten her career gnawed at me, and yet, at the same time, it pulled me closer to her in ways I could neither resist nor fully comprehend. One late evening, we found ourselves alone again, working side by side on a presentation that could define both our reputations. She leaned over to point something out, her arm brushing mine. The warmth of her touch sent a shiver through me, and I realized I was acutely aware of every small movement she made, the tilt of her head, the soft intonation in her voice, the subtle shift of her weight as she leaned closer. My mind screamed, professional boundaries, yet my heart betrayed me, aching at the closeness I both wanted and feared. She caught my gaze briefly, and for a heartbeat, the office seemed to fall away. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension between us, a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The ethical line we had both danced around felt thinner than ever. I knew any misstep could jeopardize her carefully built career, and yet the pull toward her was undeniable, magnetic. As we finally finished the work and organized our papers, I stepped back, careful to maintain distance, but my eyes lingered on her just a moment longer. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, professional, yet carrying a private weight I could feel. In that moment, I understood the precarious balance we were teetering on, desire and propriety, admiration and caution, closeness and restraint. Walking to my desk, I felt both exhilarated and anxious. Every glance, every subtle touch, had intensified feelings I couldn't yet name. And while I knew the moral dilemma we faced could not be ignored, I also realized that the connection between us had grown into something far more complicated, something I wasn't sure I was willing to resist. It was a night that felt heavier than most, the office bathed in the soft amber glow of desk lamps, the city lights outside flickering like distant stars. We were alone again, finalizing a presentation that carried weight far beyond the numbers on the slides, a decision that could shape her career, mine, and perhaps even the path of the team. The tension in the room was palpable, not just from the stakes at hand, but from the unspoken connection that had been growing between us. She looked up from her notes, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of vulnerability and the quiet strength she always carried. It could cost me everything, she admitted softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder as if seeking some anchor. The subtle quiver in her voice caught me off guard. For a moment, she wasn't the untouchable, poised figure I had admired from afar, she was just human, and suddenly, my protective instincts surged. I leaned slightly closer, careful not to invade her space but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from me. "And I'll be here," I said, my voice low and steady, "for your career, and in a way I can't hide." The word surprised even me, bold, unpolished, but sincere. I watched her reaction carefully, her composure flickering for just a heartbeat before she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, an acknowledgement of the connection we had both been skirting around for weeks. As she shifted a document closer to me, our hands brushed again. This time, it wasn't accidental. I hesitated, aware of the consequences of crossing this line, yet unable to retreat. The brush of her fingers against mine was electric but gentle, a silent affirmation of trust, courage, and the unspoken promise that neither of us needed to voice. The air between us felt charged, each movement magnified by the quiet of the office and the intimacy of the shared struggle. Her posture softened slightly, and I noticed her shoulders relax just a fraction, as if my words and presence had lifted some invisible weight. We were still professional, still careful, but the delicate tension had shifted, it was no longer a silent question, but a quiet understanding. When we finally finished the presentation, we exchanged a look that spoke volumes, mutual respect, admiration, and the faint thrill of unspoken desire. The room felt warmer, closer, as though it had shrunk to just the two of us. I packed my things slowly, savoring the lingering touch, the shared smile, and the knowledge that something profound had just begun, a subtle, daring step forward that neither of us would soon forget. The office was quiet, the night deep and still outside the tall windows. Only the soft glow of the desk lamps illuminated the room, casting warm halos over the papers scattered across the table. It was late, later than either of us usually stayed, but neither of us had made a move to leave. There was a shared understanding, unspoken yet palpable, that this night carried more than just work. She leaned over a stack of documents, her hair falling over one shoulder, catching the soft light and framing her face in a way that made my chest tighten. For the first time, she spoke not as a boss, not as a professional authority, but as herself, vulnerable, honest, and quietly human. "I don't know what I'd do if this failed," she admitted softly, her fingers tracing the edge of a folder, fingertips brushing mine accidentally, lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I swallowed the lump in my throat, stepping slightly closer. The warmth of her presence enveloped me, and I realized I wanted to offer more than words. I wanted to offer steadiness, comfort, a safe place amid the storm of her fears. "You're not alone," I said, voice low and sincere. "I'm here. Whatever happens, I've got you." The words hung between us, weighted with meaning, carrying the promise of support, care, and something more tender than either of us had dared to name. Her eyes met mine, wide and glistening in the soft light, a silent admission that she had felt the same pull, the same growing connection. The air seemed charged, every subtle movement amplified, the gentle shift of her shoulder as she leaned slightly closer, the brush of her fingers against mine as we organized papers, the quiet exhale she let slip when she realized I wasn't recoiling from her closeness. We spoke then, quietly, with an honesty that surprised us both. No declarations of love, no dramatic confessions, just two people sharing fears, hopes, and truths, the intimacy of the moment amplified by proximity and trust. I reached out, letting my hand hover near hers, brushing it lightly. She didn't pull away, instead, her hand lingered, a silent affirmation that she had been waiting for this connection as much as I had. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The office lights, the city hum, the weight of deadlines, all faded into the background. It was just her and me, breathing in sync, hearts quietly acknowledging the bond that had formed. I realized then that this connection, delicate yet profound, had shifted from tentative attraction to emotional truth. And in that stillness, that shared vulnerability, I understood that the slow burn had reached its peak, tender, heartfelt, and real. By the time we finally parted for the night, the unspoken promise hung between us. A glance, a soft brush of the hand, a smile carrying everything we hadn't yet said aloud, and I knew our story was only just beginning. The days that followed felt lighter, yet charged with a quiet awareness. Work continued as usual, deadlines loomed, and colleagues went about their routines, but between us, something fundamental had shifted. The tension that had kept me on edge for weeks was replaced by a steady, comforting warmth, a private understanding that existed in glances, subtle touches, and the silent language we had begun to develop. We found ourselves sharing small moments that felt monumental. A soft laugh over a minor mistake in a report, her hand briefly brushing mine as we passed documents, the gentle tilt of her head when listening to my input, each interaction reinforced the bond that had grown between us, now tempered by mutual respect and deep emotional intimacy. These gestures, small yet deliberate, carried more weight than words could ever convey. One evening, after a successful presentation, she suggested we walk outside to clear our heads. The city skyline was awash in the warm glow of sunset, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose. We walked side by side, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly, a simple touch that sent a familiar warmth through me. She spoke quietly, sharing a thought about the day, and I found myself savoring not just her words, but the presence, the rhythm of her voice, the subtle expressiveness in her gestures. At a moment when the conversation lulled, I reached out instinctively, letting my hand lightly rest on her back as we paused to admire the view. She didn't step away, instead, she leaned just slightly into the touch, a soft smile tugging at her lips. That small, intimate gesture, safe, tender, profoundly meaningful, spoke volumes. No words were needed. In that instant, I realized that the slow burn tension, the hesitant glances, the moments of shared vulnerability had led us here, to a quiet, unshakable connection built on trust, admiration, and mutual care. Later, as we returned to the office, our fingers brushed once more. It was a fleeting contact, yet it lingered in memory, a reminder of the bond that had blossomed between us. We both knew the risks that had existed, the boundaries carefully maintained, and yet we also knew that the emotional intimacy we had cultivated was worth every moment of hesitation. By the end of the evening, I felt a profound sense of completion and hope. The professional respect had never wavered, but alongside it had grown something far more tender, something that promised depth, trust, and a future built slowly, carefully, together. The quiet warmth between us was more than affection, it was a promise of connection that would endure, an emotional resolution that left both our hearts lighter and infinitely more open. As I left the office that night, I caught her glance one last time, and in her eyes, I saw it, acknowledgement, gratitude, and the unspoken promise that what we had begun would continue, nurtured by patience, care, and the slow, steady beat of hearts learning to belong to each other. As their hearts quietly found each other, one thing became clear: some connections are worth every risk, every pause, and every unspoken word. If you enjoyed this slow burn, age gap romance, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that warms the heart and sparks the imagination. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that surprised you when you least expected it?